Thank you very much. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center here at the Baker Institute at Rice University. Let me welcome you again, personally on behalf of the Baker Institute, to our building here. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce this second panel to you. We have 4 guests who will engage in an important conversation on corruption issues facing Mexico specifically. First is Jacqueline Pechard. Jacqueline is a renowned sociologist and served as member of the board of the Mexican Electoral Institute between 1997 and 2003. And she was also chair of Mexico's Federal Institute for Access to Public Information between 2009 and 2013. Thank you for being here, Jacqueline. Welcome. Next is Claudio X. Gonzalez. We've always wondered what the X stands for. You don't have to tell us, Claudio. Claudio is an entrepreneur and, more importantly, a tireless leader and a crucial voice for anti-corruption activism in Mexico. Claudio serves as president of the Organization of Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. In my estimation, Claudio is a man of enormous integrity, as he has been a critic of all pre-, PAN, and Morena administrations. Welcome, Claudio. We also have Mariana Campos, the Program Director of Public Budget and Accountability, which is an initiative of Mexico Evalúa. Mexico Evalúa is an organization dedicated to monitoring public spending, checking corruption, and public safety and justice reforms in Mexico, as well as monitoring the education system. Thank you, Mariana, for being here. And finally, I welcome Paul Lagunes, who is one of our resident fellows here at the Baker Institute this year. Paul is a judicious student of corruption and, of course, an organizer of this important conference. Thank you, Paul, for being here and for all the work you've done. For the dynamics of the panel, I will ask each of our guests a question. They will have about 10 minutes to answer the question and broaden their remarks as they see fit. And then Paul will engage them in a conversation before we open the panel to the audience. Immediately after that, I will give some closing remarks to conclude this panel and this conference. Thank you very much. So let me start with a question for Jacqueline, here to my left. Jacqueline, until recently, you served as the inaugural president of the National Anti-Corruption System in Mexico. What did it take to create that system, number one? And what will it take for that system to actually have an impact in reducing corruption in Mexico?
I first of all would like to thank you, Tony, for inviting me, and also Paul. Paul was also one of the ones that invited me, so thank you for hosting this conference. Now, what did it take to create the system, the anti-corruption system in Mexico? I would say that there is a paradox. We all know that President López Obrador came up during his political campaign with this main banner regarding the fight against corruption. But if we move back 6 years ago, we will see that Pena Nieto, the former president, also had this aim during his campaign. Actually, he offered, while he was campaigning, he offered to create a citizen commission of individuals that would be autonomous and that would detect, investigate, and sanction corruption. That was his offer. Now, however, when the bill came to Congress so as to make the constitutional reform to create this commission, civil society that was, they joined 32 different organizations, civil society organizations, and they said that commission is not the one that should be created in Mexico, because then it is going to be captured by political elites and they will not let this commission do anything. So these 32 organizations decided to build something that would be more sophisticated, more complicated structure, but the idea was bringing all the different political and public entities that had some part in fighting corruption, that is investigating, detecting it, or prosecuting, or even sanctioning. So bringing them all together and then have civil society work inside the system. So it was thanks to this coalition of 32 organizations that finally the system was built. Now, I would say that the relationship between civil society organizations and Pena Nieto's government was a relation in which the Pena Nieto government was illegitimate because the cases of Casablanca and the students in Ayotzinapa had just come out. And civil society was very cohesive, and they had the legitimacy so as to push the government to accept the reform bill that was necessary so as to create this system that is, it's complicated to operate because it has 6 different institutions besides a commission of citizens, that is the one that chairs the organization of the system. But it is complicated because it has to make everyone collaborate and to fix the agenda regarding which are the cases that the system should come up with and should start investigating and keep track of the full process so as to finally investigate and eventually sanction those that are identified as the one that committed these corruption cases. Now, what will it take so that this impacts? Well, the first thing is that, as Telma was saying a little before, the point is that the different political parties in Mexico have a sort of informal agreement, at least the mainstream political parties. They have a informal agreement regarding how to protect each other in corruption matters. So the problem now is that the system is not, the different parts of the system are not in place yet. We very recently had our Attorney General, which was not appointed in the last government. We do not have a special prosecutor to combat corruption. We do not have it, and it's part of the system. We do not have the 18 magistrate judges, administrative judges that are going to deal with administrative faults. And so if the system is not complete, and if you go to the different states in Mexico, because it's a federal system, you'll see that the states have not completed their local anti-corruption systems. So the system is not complete, even if it has been there for 2 years. And the explanation of why it is not complete, it is because the different political parties have not come to terms so as to how to appoint those heads of the different entities that are part of the system. So that is how it was created, thanks to this cohesion in civil society organizations. But the problem is that the government has rejected, that is, appointing all the ones that were necessary. That's one part. But I would say that the problem now is that we see that the president now, López Obrador, is engaged with fighting corruption, but he doesn't believe in institutional work. He has stated very clearly that corruption is a matter of, let's say, anomalies in personal conduct. So the only thing that you have to do is replace those public officials who are corrupt by the ones that are honest people. That's the big image, I would say. So the problem now is that we face a president that is fully engaged and committed with fighting corruption. He has all the legitimacy because he's a very popular leader, and besides, he connects very well with people. He speaks all the time and he goes to people. I mean, he's really a good leader. The problem is his concept of corruption, and that he does not believe that it's an institutional problem and that should be solved as a system and not only as political will. That is, he says, I have the will to replace all the public officials that are not that are corrupt or that move away from their legal appointments. So what will it take for the system to have an impact? I would say that 3 things are necessary. That's what I think. It's political will, which I do think that López Obrador, our president, has the political will and he's engaged in it. The former president couldn't care less about that. That is, he had to pass the reform, but because he was pushed by civil society, but really the PRI and the other parties were not really committed with that. So the political will is there. The other thing that we need is building institutional capacity. Because the problem in Mexico is that even if 20 years ago the different governments started with reforms so as to, control and audit and, face how it could be, how the public funds could be kept control of. But the problem is that when you get to prosecutors and to judges, they do not have independence and they do not have the technical capacities so as to really make a good prosecution, or to, when they come to judges are not independent, so they just keep track of whatever the government says that they should solve the cases. So we need these also, building capacities, and I'm not sure that the government at the moment understands the problem of the lack of institutional and technical capacities, not only at the local level, which is really impressive, but also at the federal level. And the third part that I think that is necessary is civil society, again, fully engaged. The problem now is that the one that has the legitimacy now is not civil society, but it's the government. The government is the one that has the legitimacy to fight corruption. So let's say that the equation has been reversed, right? So now it's the government that has the legitimacy, and civil society is, I would say, fragmented. So the formal cohesion that civil society had 6 years ago, it no longer has it, because there are parts of the organizations that say, let's support the government instead of having an independent and criticizing the different policies that the government comes up with. So I do think that we need that. I don't know if...
Yeah,
that's all right.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. That third point especially is quite interesting. The roles are reversed, and that's an invisible but important force when you have the ability to push the government as opposed to the government pushing society. Yeah. I have a question for Claudio. Some, Claudio, in Mexico describe Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, or MCCI, as Mexico's ProPublica. And we all know ProPublica in the United States. You may or may not agree with that comparison, but the real question is, how has MCCI contributed to the fight against corruption in Mexico? Can you give us the broader picture and perhaps a couple of instances of how you have tried and succeeded or failed in pushing the government?
Of course, thank you very much, Tony. And first of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here at Rice University, my first time. I'm very impressed. I've only gone through a little part of campus, but it's really amazing. And I've heard great things of Rice University and the Baker Institute. So thank you very much to the two institutions for bringing us all here. We're very happy to be here. I had a great meeting with Ambassador Jerejan before this meeting started. I enjoyed that very much. I want to also thank Paul, and I want to thank Erika for all they've done to organize the event. I also want to say that I'm very happy to share this panel with two people whom I esteem a lot and I cherish and I admire very much, Jackie, and we've been given fights in education and now in rule of law, and with Mariana, especially on this rule of law side. I think these are the two critical issues for Mexico to really settle on the foundations where it can grow much more than it's growing: quality education and rule of law. That's, I think, the two main responsibilities of our generation to Mexico. And we've given many fights. I hope it's only the beginning of many more fights to come together. Also, thank you to Susan Rose Ackerman and the panelists, because we've been learning for the last few hours very interesting things. As regarding your question, Tony, are we kind of the Mexican ProPublica? I would say it's partly true. What I first have to state is that part of our organization is modeled on ProPublica. I say the similarities are we are both NGOs, we are think and do tanks, we are against abuse and of power and corruption, and we do investigative journalism, both of us, to try and combat corruption and impunity. The differences start, well, with the fact that in Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, we don't win a Pulitzer Prize every 2 years. We are a young organization, we're only 3 years old, but continuing with the differences, I would state that our organization has a more complex model than ProPublica. We do have the investigative journalism, but we have 3 other areas to accompany that. We have applied research area, we have a strategic litigation area, and we have a communications and mobilization front. I will try to briefly develop what all of these areas do, and then try to give you a couple of examples, as you asked, Tony, as to how we try to make synergies between the 4 areas in order to have more impact. The first area is applied research. We have very top people, 6 very top researchers doing top quality studies regarding corruption. Over the last 3 years, we have finished 9 studies on differing aspects of the problem we face, ranging from the illegal funding of political campaigns. I'm in complete accordance with Telma that if we don't stop the problem during the campaigns, we're not going to stop it during the administration. And this study, among other things, which was done on deep background, like Bob Woodward did his recent book on the Trump administration, states that on the governorships campaigns before, on the 3 years previous to the federal campaign of last year, the candidates on average went above the legal ceiling for campaign spending by 11 times. Not 2 or 3 or 4 times, 11 times. So that creates a huge pressure both on the public front and the private front to funnel resources towards the elections. And this just creates a big vicious circle, no? So we've worked on that. We've worked, for example, also on nepotism and corruption in the judicial sector. 51% of our judges and magistrates have at least one relative in the judicial sector, and on average they have 3. The equivalent data for the US is 8%. So why are we 43% on top of that? We've also worked on the opacity and negligence of our health system. We've worked on corruption in the construction sector and also on the scarcity and inefficiency of compliance and anti-corruption measures on the private front, on the front of the 500 most important companies operating in Mexico. Following a Transparency International method, 100 is the top rating. The Mexican companies on that 500 biggest companies front scored at 30 out of 100. Second ranking 37 out of 100. So we're moving in the right direction, but we're way behind. But just to state that we're doing it on the public front and also the private front. One thing else on this applied research arm is that we not only do very tough diagnosis of things, we also always accompany them with policy recommendations to try to attend to our ills. Specific changes in institutions, norms, processes, regulations, etc., no? Some are being implemented, some are being ignored. We have to keep pushing. Second, there's the investigative journalism side. That's where we are paired with ProPublica, and we have 10 of the best investigative journalists in Mexico who had been working in newspapers and other media outlets for a long time. They try to seek out corruption networks, not just a specific case. We try to settle our eyes on a modus operandi of corruption. We're not interested in a specific case of corruption. We try to tackle those areas where it's systemic. One thing that differs our investigative journalism from working with us is that they have freedom. Freedom to investigate. In Mexico, unfortunately, freedom of the press is still an aspiration, especially at the local level, but also at the federal level. This is the truth, and I'm going to give you an example in 1 second. We have uncovered over the last 3 years 106 schemes of corruption, ranging from the estafa maestra, fake enterprises or ghost enterprises used by state governors to funnel resources to be stolen or to go to elections, various enterprises doing things wrong in Mexico, for example, Odebrecht. No? Nobody was talking about Odebrecht in Mexico, no? And we found out that they were financing Enrique Pena Nieto's 2012 presidential bid. Big, big scandal. What it is amazing is that in these 3.5 years, we've been able to do 106 stories on corruption. You could ask yourself, where was everybody? Why was nobody uncovering all of these problems before we came into being? When the applied research arm and the journalism side give us enough evidence to litigate, we do so. We have more than 100 administrative and criminal cases ongoing. We've lost some, we've won some, most of them are ongoing. I think strategic litigation is a key ingredient to combat impunity. And impunity, make no mistake about it, impunity is the real enemy. That is our enemy. And we have to get both the administrative branch and the judicial branch to fulfill their role and potential in creating an effective rule of law for our country. But the citizens, we have to push it. We have to get them going. Finally, we have a communications and mobilization area. We are, like ProPublica, we're not a media outlet. We have to publish through somebody else. And this is a problem in Mexico because most national newspapers would not publish one of our stories. In fact, only Reforma will publish our stories. Not Universal, not Jornada, not Milenio, not Excelsior, not El Heraldo. Only Reforma will take our stories. That's how challenged we are on this front. And on the web, Animal Político. Fortunately, we have a very good alliance with these two media, and Reforma is tops on the traditional media side, and Animal Político is tops on the new media. This area also pushes our information through the new platforms, especially Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. We are, by a long margin, the organization in Mexico that has the most outreach and interaction with the public of these platforms. But I would say this, being very critical, we are this big in those platforms. Even us, who have the most interaction with the public, we're very small. We have to get this media really going to combat corruption, no? I don't know if I'm going over my time, Tony, and I should.
Yeah, it's 30 seconds or 45 seconds
Well,
or so.
just let me say, sorry, in the 12 seconds that I have left, we try hard to have synergies between the different areas. Let me just give you a case in point. The Estafa Maestra is one of the most important journalistic investigations we've done. It states, we did it with Animal Político, let me credit them, 11 federal agencies avoiding the bidding process send $350 million at least, because we were only able to see some of the contracts, send $350 million off to the autonomous universities, because the bidding process for autonomous universities is almost non-existent. So if we're shedding light on something, they send the money to where there's obscurity. And from obscurity off to the ghost enterprises to be funneled to campaigns or to somebody's pocket. So big scandal. Our communications made sure that this, through infographics, videos, testimonies, that this traveled really far and wide. There is nobody that has some interest in Mexican politics that does not know about the Estafa Maestra.
Right. And it is very important to understand that this Estafa Maestra, this master fraud, embezzlement, however you want to translate it, did have an impact even on the elections. I mean, Mr. Meade, who was a pre-candidate, was deeply involved in this, and of course it hurt his campaign and his credibility, and now we end up with a president that may not necessarily be committed or is committed to institutions, even if he's committed to corruption. So that's how history evolves, and that's how different things end up sometimes where we don't want them to. Let me ask the last question from Mariana Campos from Mexico Evalúa. Mariana, Mexico Evalúa has positioned itself as the civil society organization dedicated to uncovering irregularities and in some cases even corruption in how public funds are handled. What are a few examples that showcase how Mexico Evalúa's contribution to controlling corruption? I receive your infographics in the mail every other day or so, and you monitor many different things very carefully. How do you think this kind of monitoring contributes then to fighting corruption, and how successful have you guys been on this? What's next as well?
Yeah, well, in my area in Mexico Evalúa, we monitor the expenditures. And we also do applied research to understand where the areas of opportunity are in the way authorities manage the budget and execute the budget. So we come very close to see corruption also, because monitoring implies to go deep and understand what is going on there. So I think we realized some years ago, like in 2013, we documented how our country follows really bad practices and weak policies during budget execution and in auditing compared to those observed even in peer countries. It seems that the Congress, for example, in Mexico, has not real power to control the execution of expenditures. I think we live in a phase similar to what was before the 70s here in the US, where presidents can do whatever they want, and it doesn't really matter what is going on in the approved budget. So then we decided to monitor and study, like for 5 years, these gaps between the public expenditures and their approved budget. And we realized that the gaps are growing, and especially in unregulated funds from a special branch that is called Branch 23. So we realized that since 2009, the federal government started to increase the amounts of money to state governments through these funds. And this was besides the traditional regulated funds that usually go to the state governments. We identified that there was no legal basis for these funds to be fueled with money, and that the funds used to change the names during the years. So it was really hard to follow these funds. Then we did a lot of interviews and understood how these funds were actually used in the political point of view. And we did a lot of anonymous interviews to former bureaucrats and congressmen. And then we realized that these funds were used by the federal government to control the legislative branch, to buy political power there, and to keep budget discussions in zero. And also to pass reforms, and also to control the governors in the Governor's Commission. So the Governor's Commission appeared to be very smooth. After that, this scheme was built by the PAN party in Mexico in the year 2009. But, and they say that this was built because the PAN faced a lot of opposition in the Congress. The PRI had a strong opposition during those years, and the PAN had all the legislative agenda totally off. So, but even though the PAN was the creator of the scheme, Enrique Pena Nieto and the PRI took the most advantage of this scheme, so the funds allow them to lead the Pact for Mexico and get political support for getting past an ambitious political reform package. So they used 30% of the tax reform that was passed in 2014. 30% was used in these secret grants with no transparency, with no conditions that were delivered to the governors. And it seems that also these funds had granted low oversight, since the Superior Audit Body was reviewing very few of this money, less than 10% was reviewed. And so there was a lot of abuse in this money. If you research on corruption in Mexico, especially the one that is done in the state level, you're gonna get to know the story of Javier Duarte in Veracruz, the former governor, who reached a record in the official abuse of funds. And also from the governor of Chihuahua, that he's actually a fugitive right now from justice. And he also did a lot of corruption with those funds. So these funds were key to those, for those governors. And we showed in our studies how these amounts transferred to the state governments tend to increase in electoral years, especially in those states where governors belong to the same party, and amounts decreased in states with governors from opposing parties. So it was a clear use of this money to control politically also the outcomes of elections. It's very clear that in 2011 and in 2017, both were previous years of presidential elections. During each year, the PAN in 2011 and PRI in 2017 clearly awarded more money to their state allies through these unregulated funds. Fortafin is the name of the most important fund that was used during this time. And there was a very important point in this story, and it comes with the role of the governor, the actual governor of Chihuahua, that he started to chase or to investigate corruption in his state, especially from the former governor Cesar Duarte, that he used these funds to finance pre-campaigns, not only in Chihuahua, but also in other states. And he actually, the government of Chihuahua prosecuted people from the pre-party that are actually in Yale. And then the governor of Chihuahua the federal government stopped the funds to go to Chihuahua. So he experienced budget cuts because he was investigating the Pena Nieto's allies in the state. So this was a very important point to understand how the political control it's in the transfers that the federal government sends to state governments, and how impunity is kept. Because if you stand out or investigate and prosecute corruption, then you have a financial punishment. And so when this revelation was in the public, and this governor went out in the public opinion, we were about to finish our study, the 5-year study, and we soon after got it done and put it out in the public. And I think it was good for the public discussion, since it was not only the version of a governor, but there was this think tank documenting a research on how these transfers have been used politically. So our recommendation has always been that the federal pact should be reviewed, and that we have to diminish the political control of the federation to the states, in order to not only to spend better the money, but also to being able to face corruption. Because if we use the federal money to stop and to keep the impunity pact in Mexico, it's going to be very, very hard. And after our job, our study was disclosed, the Superior Audit Institution devoted a special review to these secret grants for the first time. So we were very happy about it. And in December, there was a conference in the Chamber of Representatives where this superior body institution said that after finishing this special audit, they find out that Fortafin Fund has the record of observations in the history of these institution reviews. So the way the money was used is totally related to frauds. Even though specialists recommended the new government of Moreno that is now in charge in Mexico to, rather than eliminating the funds, should be changing the rules, even the informal rules. I mean the informal rules, because these funds have no official rules. Instead of asking for political support or keeping impunity to transfer the money, Fortafin can actually work well to pay for fostering institutional development and financial strengthening with local governments. We really need a fresh new deal in the federal pact. However, the funds from Branch 23 were finally eliminated from the new president's first budget. And there was just one fund that was left to finance ongoing public works that are right now in the local level. And I think that this opens a whole new chapter, because even though these funds were used for corruption, the state's finances now depend on them. So sooner than later, some conflicts will arise and have been arising. During the budget discussion, there was a conflict because some states were unable to pay teachers. Teachers from public universities, so because they knew that they were cutting these funds, so there was a conflict on that, and also the conflict that is right now going on in the state of Michoacan, where this union of teachers has closed a trainway, and some merchandising can get to their final destiny, and it's really making a huge problem in the economy, because many merchandise can get to the destiny. So, and this conflict, it's because some governors are very angry right now for many reasons and for many policies that the new president is implementing. But one reason is that they got these funds cut. So I think we're gonna see during the year upcoming conflicts around these funds. And inside Morena, there's a huge discussion on what to do with the transfers to the states. This conversation hasn't gone very public, but it's going between the president of the Budget Commission in Congress and the president. And the president of the Budget Commission wants to put in the agenda a national discussion on transfers to states. And the president, I think, he doesn't want to have that discussion. So let's see what happens and how these conflicts arising in the states from these cuts in the budget are going to raise the discussion in order to finally have this formal discussion of transfers. The last discussion, national discussion on federalism and the transfers, happened 15 years ago. So maybe this is the opportunity to talk about this topic, which is very important in Mexico, because a lot of corruption happens in the state level. And if you say the word governor in Mexico, people think the same of a governor as to a mafia leader. So we need to change that, and we really need to discuss this topic. So I think that Mexico Evalúa put in the public eye a very interesting piece to document how weak is our federalism, our budget process execution. We are missing a lot of counterbalance, and we are full of bad practices that are fueling all the corruption that we see.
Thank you, Mariana. Before I turn over the conversation to Paul, who's going to ask a couple of questions of our panelists, I have to tell you that when I run the numbers in my head as our speakers were talking, I realized that there's about 130 million people in Mexico, of whom 30 million voted for Mr. López Obrador, and another 28 million or so, 27, 28 million didn't vote for him. So it's not, he's got certainly a majority, but not an overwhelming majority. It's almost one out of every two citizens didn't go his way. And most governors are still not in his party. We'll see the first test on June 2nd, when 6 states will have elections. And what we see in Mexico, and I think this is something that our guests are a witness to, is the fact that there may be 50, 60 million poor people, but there's also 50, 60 million middle class strong who carry out efforts like this one. So there is hope. The raw material to create a real good, legitimate movement in the citizenry, in the middle class in Mexico is there. And the efforts of many, many different groups throughout the country are also a good beginning, and I think the labor that you guys do is truly encomiable. So thank you very much for being here. So Paul will lead now the discussion, and then I will close our panel and conference. Paul.
Great. So Tony, thank you very much for supporting this event as well. I want to thank Erica. I think on that note of hope, there are centers like the Baker Institute that are trying to generate a discussion around these issues in search for solutions. So if I may, let's go back in time a bit to July 2nd, 2000. I was watching the television with my father. That night was election night in Mexico. And as the news was coming out of the results, the electoral results, my father said, Vicente Fox is not going to win. They're not going to let him. He was jaded. He was cynical. A few minutes later, the election results were called in his favor. So this effort, this decades-long effort to establish electoral democracy in Mexico was finally reached, something that people had thought was impossible. Now, maybe that opportunity was not used in the best manner, and that's why we are now in the second chapter, this V2.0 for Mexico, that is controlling corruption. That's another major point in the agenda that needs to be reached. Yet, or I should say, we don't need to stick to that cynicism, or we can be skeptical, we know, but we shouldn't stick to that cynicism. I think there are reasons for hope. I think this conversation has given some reasons for hope when we see what Thelma Aldana has done, what the Lavallato Task Force has done, what the members of this panel have done. So with my couple questions, and then I think we want to leave ample room for discussion and Q&A, I want us to look at the sources of grounded hope for Mexico in controlling corruption. The first question I would ask is actually jumping on what Mariana was focusing on, which is the subnational. Her presentation had a refreshingly subnational flavor to it. We don't only need to focus on the president of Mexico when it comes to fighting corruption, or on Congress, or we need to also look at the governors, the mayors. What they've done in Mexicanos contra la Corrupción has also looked at the urban development problem in Mexico City, for example. So my question is, let's build on what Mariana was saying, and let's focus on some ideas, some possible solutions for corruption from the ground up. Can you think, and I'll start with Jacqueline, can you think of some possible solutions of the corruption problem from the ground up?
I should start. I'm sorry. Well, I do think that it's civil society and academia have been working on the corruption, investigating corruption cases. And I do think that the way to go from the grassroots, from the bottom up, is with these investigations. That is what Mariana and her group of Mexico Evalúa have done, is very similar to what is happening in some different states. Actually, when we were in the process of building the national anti-corruption system, we discovered what was really surprising for us was that in many states, there was this sort of building of organizations which we thought that were only at the national level or at the Mexico City level. And we discovered that there is a lot of energy and groups being formed socially in different states in Mexico. So I do think that that is promising for us. I mean, having these groups that have been created, that is a sort of example from the original national civil organizations. So I do think that that would be an idea.
Well, I think this is Mariana's strong suit, so she will close with the most solid remarks. They've studied this very much, but I would say that we've done a lot of work at the subnational level, and we're very clear, as she stated, that we have a huge problem at that level. I mean, if we don't have enough transparency, supervision, controls, equilibriums regarding the resources at the federal level, they're mostly non-existent at the local level. I mean, non-existent. And lots of money has been transferred to the states with almost no control. So you have to build up those controls, which are not there yet. They're not mature enough at the federal level, but you have to construct it simultaneously at the federal level and also at the local level. That is critical. Second, I think in many respects, the states in Mexico are free riders. They receive, and Mariana can give us the percentage, but a huge amount of what they spend from the federal government. They charge very little taxes, and they don't want to charge because it's a comfortable situation not to be taxing your people or very lightly, and to just be waiting for the government to send you money and then not having real controls over how you spend it. So I think it's a mess, and we have to get that right. But part of the responsibility, I think, will come when they charge more, because they will be a different player before the federal government. I mean, the governors are really, it's humiliating, no? The relationship to the president and to the federal government. It's really, I think, but for a few governors, they have to do, or they have to cede to the federal government because they have no fiscal power. And on the other side, if the local people know that their taxes are being sent to the governor, they're going to do a lot more auditing on the civic side of those resources. So I think that's some of the things that we're doing. In Mexicanos contra la Corrupción, we'll continue working in that direction. We should work more closely with Mexico Evalúa. I just wrote that down because we have to be closer. And we're starting up Poblanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad. It's already going, and we might be getting going San Luis Potosí very soon. So we're going to start extending to different regions of the country to try to emulate what we're doing at the federal level, at the local level.
I think that the federal pact has been wasted. Like, it's a great tool that we could use, and we haven't been using it right. Totally the opposite. We have been using it wrong, because we have been sending money to the states and to the municipalities without asking real and good conditions in return. For example, many of them, they still have no decent audit institution in their governments. It's unbelievable, but many of them, their institutions, their audit institutions, have to ask the political power if they can approve the auditing program. Many of them get their public servants out whenever there's a new governor. And also when they find fraud or something, they have to ask permission to publish or to get to the prosecutor, the state's prosecutor. So it's crazy the way how corruption has actually designed our institutions. And I think that the federal pact can be a good tool to say, if you want to receive your money, you need to get done these milestones in terms of capacity and institutional strengthening their institutions. I think that maybe the political power has been dominating the federal pact. I know that it's going to always be a very important element on it, but we need to, I don't know, to build upon other means. And that is not going to be easy. I think that the way the new government sees the situation is, in my perspective, very disappointing, because the states are like this. Imagine having a daughter or a son at the age of 40 living in your house without working, drinking, crashing the card, spending the cards. And I think that this government, instead of building capacity, putting limits and incentive the capacity building, it's instead saying, okay, I'm gonna keep doing your job, I'm gonna keep you like this, I'm just not gonna talk to you. That's it. That's the way it's actually working right now. So we're not gonna really solve the problems. We really need to push for a better pact between both levels or three levels of government. But I also think that there is something missing in trying to fight corruption. And I think that this has to be a lot more from a different point stand, not thinking on public policy, thinking on the reward on people for getting into a new system, because corruption is a system in Mexico. So we have to think more in terms of collective action. The first people that put a limit to corruption, decide to live in a different way, they're gonna face huge costs on doing that. So we have to think on the institutions on how we are going to reward the first heroes. How are we going to make easy for people to change this way of living? So I think that we should be thinking on that while building our institutions, our anti-corruption system, and all the reforms that we have in the list.
So on that note, I think I have a question for each of you, individual questions. So Mariana, when Tony organizes a future version of this conference, and maybe is encouraged to invite somebody from the subnational level, so I'll give you some time to think about this. Who are some local heroes that Tony and the Baker Institute should consider inviting to this future version of this event? So who's a local hero or two or three, or an organization that should be considered for such an event? Claudio, I have a genuine question for you, and it's this. You mentioned the Odebrecht scandal, and that was a scandal that, as Susan's slide showed, was a shock on the entire region. Now, I've studied Mexico and Peru quite closely, and Peru has been forceful in fighting or in confronting the Odebrecht scandal in its geography, whereas Mexico, not so much, frankly. And when we see what Mexico does have, it has bold reporters and some bold newspapers, some. It has a democracy, an electoral democracy. It has various things in its favor, and yet it's not acting the way we'd like it to act when it faces a scandal like that one. So my question for you, Claudia, would be, what's missing? What do you think is missing, given everything that Mexico does have in its favor? And Jacqueline, the question I had for you was, there are a lot of people who are hopeful for this new president, and that this new president can make a difference. He was elected on an anti-corruption agenda. There are a lot of people who are hopeful that he can make a difference in that direction. What do you think, what are some ideas that come to your mind of what can bring him to support, to lend his weight to back the national anti-corruption system? Mm-hmm. So I'll let you all figure out who's going to go first.
Should I start?
Sure.
Well, as I was saying at the beginning, it's the way that the president understands corruption. He has said insistently that corruption should be wiped out simply by sweeping corruption from the upper staircase to the lower ones. That is, it is in the leaders, right? Through the example that they set, that the others are going to move in the same way. So I do think that this is a very simple idea of corruption. And he's not convinced of a systemic corruption, but rather a voluntary act of the different public officials. Now, what do I think? I do think that if the Controller General, which is part of the government, that, Irmeréndira Sandoval has said that she's going to support the system. So if she is able to convince López Obrador that it is not only a matter of public will, but that it is a matter of building institutions and making procedures, institutional procedures work, then this is going to move a little forward. If not, I do think that we may come at the end having some scapegoats that will go to prison, most probably, if the case comes, but not really fighting corruption as a systemic thing that goes through institutional procedures. So I do think that López Obrador has the legitimacy, and he knows how to call on people so as to support them. And we see that through the different surveys, how even if there is criticism towards some of the policies that he has started building, when it comes to what the people think of him, that is, his popularity has raised. So I do think that what we need, or what we lack at the moment, is some counterbalances regarding what the president himself and his very strong personal leadership is doing.
I think that at the local level, we have a lot of heroes in Mexico. And I think of the journalists. It's really risky to be a watchdog in the States. It's totally different of the situation that we in México Evalúa or Mexicanos contra la Corrupción face in Mexico City. I know some organizations that sometimes they call us and they tell us, we have this case, we realize there's corruption in 30 public works projects. This was in the state of Coahuila, a northern state. But we're really afraid to go out into a press conference. But we really need to do the press conference because it's part of our grant. But we can't face the situation. What happens if you then take the study and say it in Mexico City? So this is the kind of the dilemmas that these organizations face, is risky. That day, I said to this organization, no, you have to face it, and I'm going to be with you in your state. So I went there, and I was in the event. And the media were harassing the investigators. It was really disgusting. They were paid, maybe by the governor, or, the governor, and they were harassing the investigators. So it was really bad, but this is the kind of scenario that we have in the States. I also think the grassroots organizations, especially from the people that have really suffered corruption and crime in Mexico, and there, there's a lot of people that have disappeared in this context of insecurity and violence, and they are looking for their family members that have disappeared, and they have made great communities to fight this corruption and also to search for their missing members. So I think we have a lot of heroes down there, and I think that we need in the city and to connect the think tanks and the organizations in the city to connect better with these organizations in the local level. I think we will raise our impact.
Let me just add to what Mariana was saying, and I agree completely with what she's saying, that it's a great idea. I think you should bring some of these people up and have them talk to you about the struggles that they've suffered. I have two particular names. Eric Ramirez in Michoacán, for example, he faces up to the toughest, strongest and most violent union in Mexico, la Coordinadora Nacional de Trabajadores de la Educación, every single day. Every single day, alone. He's the head of Mexicanos Primero, which is the equivalent to Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, but in education. And he's an incredible person who everybody should meet. Lupillo González, a guy from San Luis Potosí, he brought us an investigation. He's not a journalist. He's a small businessman. But he was so enraged with the corruption in San Luis Potosí, he started an investigation, and he brought us a file about how, I think it's 16 or 18 members of the local Congress, each and every one of them, from PRI, PAN, Morena, MC, from all the different parties, all of them had received money from the governor to pass different legislative acts or to approve different executive measures. All of them. And when we brought out this story after learning it from Lupillo, they just stayed quiet. About, I think, 12 of them wanted to have other posts in the last election. 10 of them lost. No? Lupillo made that happen. You have to meet these people. And we need many more of these people. Now, in trying to answer the issue of why we haven't gone as far on the Odebrecht issue, which is, I think it's multi-variable, but I'll also try to say something about what, or to being in accord with Jackie, but to sum to what she was saying. Odebrecht, part is the pact of impunity that has prevailed in Mexico over so much time. Impunity, 2016 figures, 97-point-something% in Mexico. Almost impossible to go lower. Almost impossible. That's amazing. In Latin America, we're usually at the front. In this specific issue of impunity, we're dead last, or close to dead last. Incredible for a country of 130 million people with the economic dynamism of Mexico. Just hard to fathom. There was a pact of impunity. This is a very grave issue because of what Jackie was saying, the lack of legitimacy in the Pena Nieto administration. And it started during the campaign. And Odebrecht in particular financed the campaign of Pena Nieto. I know he financed campaigns of other presidents, but by the time that we brought Odebrecht, the Odebrecht issue to Mexico, his presidency was tilting on the balance. And the guy who ran Pemex and received more money from Odebrecht after the election was the same guy who was receiving money from Odebrecht during the campaign, Emilio Lozoya, a very, very, very close associate of President Pena Nieto, who knows a lot about other corruption issues of President Pena Nieto, the most corrupt president Mexico has had in many, many decades, and that is saying something. And that is saying something. So, and now, I think for me, the critical issue, the lack of true independence in the Attorney General's office. Because every one of the four, I think, Attorney Generals, no, during the Peña administration, there were 4 Attorney Generals, I think. 4 or 5. Every one of them was handpicked by Peña Nieto, and every one of them did whatever he said they should do. If they acted against Javier Duarte or Roberto Borges, the governors of Veracruz and Quintana Roo, it was because they were somehow expendable politically. No, they had to take a hit for the team. But Lozoya was too close for comfort. And I hope we had a Telma, or we had a Paulo Roberto, or we had a Sergio Moro in Mexico, but we don't have one. And unfortunately, 2 other issues blocking the Odebrecht investigation. First, this President López Obrador, who was elected essentially to combat corruption because he positioned himself well on that front, and he's personally austere. So for many Mexicans, this is a sign of honesty. Sorry, austerity and honesty are 2 different things. Right? Somebody talked here, I think it was Professor Ackerman, about political corruption versus private corruption versus bureaucratic corruption, etc., no? I'm not sure how Morena and López Obrador would do on the political corruption side. Maybe at the personal level, they don't want to enrich themselves. But I would question this other issue. And he declared during campaign and then transition, that he would declare a general amnesty on the corruption of the past administration. How can you ever do that? And how can that ever happen in a civilized country? First, because he was elected to combat that corruption. So in many respects, he's going against the will of the people. Second, could Donald Trump or even Mr. Bolsonaro say everybody's excused of their wrongdoings over the last 6 years? Where could that ever stand? Well, that's what Mr. López Obrador did. Only other issue, he chose his head of the Attorney General's office the way Enrique Pena Nieto did. He pointedly refused to give autonomy and independence to the Attorney General's office. Not a good sign. Because of all of this, there's not enough advance on the investigations on Odebrecht. If he gets into real trouble, he might have to move and act against somebody like Lozoya and Odebrecht. But it will take some doing to get him there, and unfortunately he's taking other measures that I think will push us there sometime not too far away in time.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Tony, I'm just going to hand the microphone to you so as to manage time and manage questions.
If you have any questions, I think we have maybe 10 minutes for Q&A before we hit to close at 6 sharp. So please, there's a microphone there and there. If there are any pressing questions. I have a question real quick while the people come to the microphone. In Texas, we have something that is called a plural executive, which means the controller, the treasurer, the attorney general, the governor, the lieutenant governor, all these different figures, which in Mexico would be part of the executive and appointed, are elected completely independently. And when we vote in Texas, we elect each of them separately. So the attorney general is elected separate from the governor, completely apart, and is not beholden to the governor. In fact, he will have to go back for re-election and answer. Now, this doesn't guarantee anything, because our attorney general has actually used his power to go after migrants and all kinds of mischiefs. So it doesn't guarantee that you will have a reasonable, decent human being in the post. But at least he's not beholden to the governor. Is that a solution? Anybody?
Yeah. I mean, it looks very attractive, that is having people electing the different posts. The problem is, which is the party behind? I mean, if we had had this in elections in 2018, they would have all come from Morena, right? Because it was such a tsunami, new political party, or very recently formed. So I'd like to comment on something that we've been building on since the past panel, and that has to do with having heroes as the solution to the fight against corruption. And well, I feel quite uncomfortable with this, because we've been saying that this is not a problem of personal conduct or personal attitude, but it's something that is well embedded in institutions. So, but what I see is that the good, the successful anti-corruption acts have been led by very important personal leaders, and not through institutions. But when I was listening to Paulo's presentation, he said, well, having this Coritiba task force was a product of 20 years of having independent judges and independent prosecutors. So we do have to have some, let's say, institutional support behind these heroes.
Absolutely.
Let me pick up a couple questions here and then there. I'll take all three of them because we got about 6-7 minutes left. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to allude to systemic change. There was this concept as well of redefining the federal pact. What Tony, you just described, I think that alludes to that. You know, you pass the power locally to people, you know, at state level. It's people locally in their communities making decisions about who's there. And then you may also have like fiscal changes so that states manage taxes and pass all of these, but this is very major, you know, to do that kind of change from what is now to this kind of redistribution of power, that's major. I would like to ask you about the feasibility, the possibility of these major changes. The other, perhaps equally challenging change is with regard to impunity. And we have seen, you know, there were great examples and a few references here about the terrible state of impunity in Mexico. But there are also some very recent examples, like what we have seen very recently with this fight against gasoline theft. No one is being prosecuted. You know, there have been measures, there have been big events, 0 individuals or groups being prosecuted. You know, is it feasible to expect major changes in the medium term?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll take those 2 questions over here. Yes, sir.
What impact will Trump's Great Wall have on the Mexican economy and free trade and eliminating corruption? And do you think Donald Trump is going to go ahead with building that wall?
Thank you. And the next and last?
Yes, is there a possibility to separate political crime and corruption from street crime, basically cartels? Is that ever going to happen?
Right. Let's begin with you, Jacqueline.
Well, I'll start by the final question, because I do think that political corruption and bureaucratic corruption in Mexico have been enhanced through the links between politicians and the crime and public crime. I mean, I do think the investigations that we've seen is that they are really linked, and so it's important to know that it's because they are accomplices in this crime and the public posts.
Claudia? Yeah.
Do we give changes a chance? I think that, I mean, if you're doing what we're trying to do, you have to be hopeful. We're not in this to lose, no? It will take a long time. But I would say this, we're looking bad right now. I even compared Mexico to Latin America in a negative light regarding these specific issues of law and rule of law. However, one must state that every single country, every single state, anywhere and everywhere around the world passed through where we're going right now. At some point in time, you were in this, the US was in this situation. Not that very long ago, no? I remember my lessons about the robber baron era and many such other cases. And even in the 1960s, presidential elections being contested as to whether they were really valid or they were not valid, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's not that long ago. And you still have a long way to go. This is always relative, because corruption is always at the prowl. Then you cannot lower your guard because they'll advance. So we have to walk faster, we have to run after the solutions, and I think we know what the solutions are. I think our president has the political will. I agree with Jackie. I just don't think he has this other thing that Jackie's asking for, the will or even the right ideas as to how to construct institutions that will derive in different incentives for society, which is, I think, absolutely the critical issue. He's thinking about himself and his political movement and not so much about institutional buildup. That is kind of secondary to him, and I think that's too bad. But we're going to be pushing and pushing and pushing because, and this makes me also hopeful, there is momentum in Mexico from the public side and the press side. I don't think there has ever been more momentum and pressure from the civil society side and the press to arrange this issue. Most of the elections in the last 6 years have been decided by who was seen as least corrupt. No other issue really counted. That, we have to make it count for something. When he starts getting into, the water starts getting to his nose, he's going to ask for results. And they're going to tell him, you know, we're sitting on a Model T Attorney General's office. We have to modernize this thing, because otherwise we cannot give you results. And that's when we have to pounce with all that we've been pushing for institutional change, professionalization, independence, etc. No? So we have to be right there on time. I don't want to get very much into the wall. I think it's an issue that our President López Obrador has pretty much ignored, and I think he does well to ignore it. I think it's just political symbolism. And I don't think it's going to stop a relationship that has been growing and growing and growing and growing. I know we need the US a lot, but I think the US also needs Mexico a lot, and Canada. And we should be building this North American pact, no? Rather than just the commercial pact.
Mariana, last word.
Yes. About the big changes, I think that I agree that we have momentum, and the one thing that is keeping AMLO with a lot of popularity these days is that he has political will to go against corruption. Even though he has been taking very unreasonable decisions in the first 2 months at the office, and he's maybe contributing to a slowdown in the economy that already very good economists are seeing in the first indicators. I think that even though that people are really approving him because they were really thirsty to see the political will in someone. Let's see, and I think that it's going to be soon, more soon than later, how these bad outcomes that are going to happen, at least in the economic scenario, are going to make him learn or be willing to learn more and listen more to civil society or specialists. Let's see that. I think that's going to be like the turning point. I don't think we're going to achieve a lot in these 6 years, but maybe we can get into some interesting changes in case he learns from his first mistakes.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Baker Institute, the Mexico Center, and the Latin America Initiative, clearly this has been a fascinating set of discussions. I think the central takeaway from that is that corruption costs. It costs in terms of the quality of the institutions that govern us. It costs in terms of economic growth and equality and wealth. It corrodes the social and political fabric of our societies. It prevents the development of social capital, and it cheats the poor out of a leveler playing field. And in the end, it has a profound effect on the quality of life for all of us. Before I thank you for your attention today, let me take 1 minute of your time to say something about a colleague and a friend, Erika de la Garza, Latin American Initiative Director. Today is Erika's last conference at the Baker Institute as the Director of the Latin American Initiative. Erica has chosen to retire and to spend her next decades engaged in other endeavors. But we at the Baker Institute and at the Mexico Center cannot forget that Erica has been here for much longer than most of us, probably 20 years or so. Has made the Latin America Initiative an important voice on issues pertaining to U.S.-Latin American relations, and as a director of the Mexico Center, I must recognize was instrumental in conceiving and building the Mexico Center, which I now direct. Erica is a strategic mind, a terrific colleague, a fantastic friend. We want to thank her today for all the work she has done for Houston, for our community, for the Baker Institute, and certainly as a colleague and a friend. We will miss her in the hallways of the Baker Institute, even though she will remain connected with the Baker Institute, but she won't have a presence here on a day-to-day basis. So, Erica, please join me to present to you a small thank you note from all of us. Come on.
I'm speechless, but thank you so much. It's been really an amazing ride to be at the Baker Institute. And thank you for coming today. Thank you, my dear friend, and you carry on. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this afternoon with us. Have a good evening, and please help me thank our guests again. Thank you very much.